What if every revolution in history followed the same 6 stages, and America is already at stage 4? Imagine the echoes of France, Russia, and Cuba playing out across centuries, a pattern so precise it almost reads like a script written in blood and chaos. The streets fill with tension, the elite feel untouchable, and the people, growing restless, edge closer to a tipping point that no one seems to see coming. If these patterns continue, the next stage is the one societies fear the most.
It always begins quietly. Long before the streets fill with anger, long before governments tremble, there's a shift, subtle, almost invisible. People start feeling something they can't quite describe, a sense that the promises they were raised to believe in aren't being kept anymore, that the system, once trusted, no longer works the way it should. In France, just before 1789, the signs were everywhere. The royal debt had grown so enormous that even bread, basic, simple bread, became a luxury. Families stood in endless lines, not for abundance, but for survival. Inequality wasn't just visible, it was suffocating. And yet, the king's court lived in a world so distant, it might as well have been another planet. Russia felt the same tremors in 1917. While the Tsar's regime held tightly to tradition, the country beneath it was cracking apart. Economic failure, military losses, and the widening gap between rulers and ordinary people created a tension too powerful to hide. And in every case, the same feeling spread: distrust, doubt, a growing belief that those in power were no longer capable of steering the nation forward. Even today, in modern times, we can see similar shadows: polarization rising, trust falling, people questioning the very institutions built to protect them. It's the first sign in the cycle, the decline of confidence. When that confidence finally cracks, something shifts in the streets. The frustration that once lived quietly inside individual homes begins to spill outward, connecting people who might never have spoken to each other before. Different voices, different backgrounds, but the same growing anger, the same realization that nothing changes unless someone forces it to. In France, it began with bread. What started as desperate crowds searching for food turned into organized demands for accountability. Those early bread riots weren't just about hunger, they were about dignity. They were about people finally saying enough. Russia saw its own spark when workers filled the factories and streets, their strikes growing louder, louder, impossible to ignore. These weren't isolated protests, they were the early steps of a movement that would soon rewrite an entire nation. Cuba followed the same trajectory. What began as frustration under the Batista regime soon turned into a unified resistance fueled by anger, corruption, and a growing belief that the system simply could not continue as it was. And even in modern America, we can see echoes, waves of activism, massive protests, entire communities demanding justice, accountability, and change. The issues might be different, the world more modern, but the rhythm, the energy, the tension, those feel eerily familiar. This is stage 2, when anger transforms into action and the pressure begins to rise. As protests grow louder and movements gain momentum, the real breaking point comes not from the people, but from the system itself. Institutions that once felt unshakable begin to wobble under the weight of rising pressure. Laws that once brought order suddenly lose their force. Leaders who once commanded respect now struggle to hold even their own supporters together. In France, the Estates General, meant to represent the entire nation, collapsed under the tension of inequality and political paralysis. It wasn't just a governmental failure, it was a signal that the old structure could no longer contain the anger building beneath it. Russia experienced the same unraveling. The provisional government, weak and overwhelmed, couldn't manage the economic chaos, the war, or the people demanding immediate change. Each failure chipped away at whatever trust remained until the entire system stood hollow and fragile. Cuba mirrored this pattern as corruption inside Batista's regime reached a breaking point. Scandals, abuses of power, and a widening disconnect between rulers and citizens created a government that looked strong from the outside but was rotting from within. And even in modern America, we can see echoes, waves of activism, massive protests, entire communities demanding justice, accountability, and change. The issues might be different, the world more modern, but the rhythm, the energy, the tension, those feel eerily familiar. This is stage 2. When the old order starts cracking, history warns us, the cycle accelerates.
Stage 4 is where the tension stops being a background hum and becomes impossible to ignore. It's the moment when society begins to split, not just politically, but emotionally, culturally, and even spiritually. Two groups can look at the same event, the same facts, the same reality, and walk away believing they've witnessed two completely different worlds. When that happens, unity isn't strained, it's shattered. This is the stage historians fear the most, because once a nation reaches it, the pressure inside every crack begins to multiply. Internal conflict intensifies, economic stress tightens its grip on families already struggling, culture clashes turn everyday disagreements into existential battles, and beneath it all, one hard truth grows larger. People no longer trust one another, and they no longer trust the system meant to hold them together. Across history, this is the point where revolutions move from possibility to probability. And many historians believe America is standing in this very phase today. Not collapsing, not falling apart, but undeniably divided in a way that mirrors the fourth stage of past revolutions. Not a prediction, just a pattern, a warning. When a society splits into two realities, the cycle doesn't slow down, it speeds up. Stage 5 is the moment when the pressures of the previous stages finally converge and change becomes unstoppable. It's the point where ordinary frustration turns into collective action, where movements that once simmered quietly erupt into something undeniable. In history, this is where revolutions shift from warning signs to unstoppable forces. In France, the storming of the Bastille didn't just take down a prison, it marked the collapse of the monarchy itself. The people weren't just angry, they had organized, rallied behind leaders, and seized the moment to rewrite their nation's destiny. Russia, too, followed the same path. The Bolsheviks didn't merely protest, they took control, promising peace, land, and bread to a population desperate for stability. The provisional government was swept aside almost effortlessly because the groundwork had already been laid through years of mistrust, frustration, and radicalized support. Cuba, too, reached its tipping point when Castro and his movement, hardened by years of resistance and failure, finally succeeded in overthrowing Batista. The revolution had mass support because the population had grown too exhausted, too disillusioned, and too desperate for change. Even in modern contexts, patterns show that when a revolutionary shift begins, it spreads quickly, unpredictably, and often violently. The sparks are inevitable because the foundation has already been shaken by mistrust, inequality, and institutional failure. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and stage 5 is where the echoes of the past become almost impossible to ignore. Stage 6 is the culmination, the point every revolution ultimately reaches, where the old order is fully toppled and a new system rises from its ashes. It's rarely the peaceful, orderly change people hope for. Instead, it is messy, chaotic, and often more extreme than anyone anticipated.
In France, the revolution that began with ideals of liberty and equality ended with the guillotine and the rise of Napoleon, dragging the nation into years of war and uncertainty. Russia's Bolshevik takeover led to civil war, famine, and purges that claimed millions of lives before the Soviet Union stabilized under authoritarian rule. Cuba, after Batista fled, became a rigid communist state where freedoms were curtailed and a new hierarchy replaced the old one. The lesson is clear. Revolutions rarely deliver the promises that ignite them. They dismantle the familiar structures, but what emerges is a new order, often more extreme, sometimes oppressive, and always irreversible. History shows that when societies pass through these stages, the change is profound, permanent, and usually far more chaotic than anyone foresaw. The reason this cycle repeats across centuries and continents is rooted in something timeless: human nature. Inequality, economic strain, leadership failures, and the widening gap between rulers and the ruled create pressure that no society can contain indefinitely. Every nation, no matter how advanced or wealthy, carries the seeds of its own instability. In France, Russia, Cuba, the patterns were the same. A small elite amassed wealth and power while the majority struggled. Corruption eroded trust, institutions failed to respond, and the people, once they realized the system could not deliver justice, sought alternatives, often with devastating consequences. This universality is the warning. No country is immune. The cycle doesn't discriminate by geography, ideology, or wealth. It moves quietly, invisibly, until one day it isn't quiet anymore. And unless societies recognize these early stages and act to address the imbalance, the same story will repeat itself over and over in slightly different forms across history. Ignoring the early warning signs has always come at a terrible cost. History is full of nations that could have softened the blow. France might have reformed its tax system. Russia might have addressed military and economic failures earlier. Cuba might have limited corruption and offered real avenues for change. But instead, the delays, the denials, and the missteps made collapse inevitable. Yet there are rare examples where awareness and timely reform slowed or even prevented the cycle from reaching its most violent stages. Britain, Scandinavia, and other nations managed to navigate social pressure through gradual change, addressing inequalities and adapting institutions before frustration exploded into chaos. The lesson is clear: it's never too late to break the cycle. But breaking it requires recognition, courage, and action before history's pattern moves past the point of no return. Waiting, denying, or hoping it won't happen only ensures that the consequences, when they come, will be far worse than they needed to be.
Looking at the United States today through this historical lens, the path forward is not predetermined, but the patterns are unmistakable. Societies that reach this point often face a few possible directions, each shaped by how they respond to the pressures building around them. One path is reform, addressing economic inequality, rebuilding trust in institutions, and creating policies that give people hope in the system. This route can stabilize a society before frustrations boil over. Another path is continued polarization, where divisions deepen and the two sides of society become increasingly isolated, seeing entirely different realities. In such a scenario, the risk of conflict grows, and even small sparks can ignite widespread unrest. A third possibility is unexpected stability, where leadership manages to navigate crises with careful strategy, avoiding major collapse, but only if society remains vigilant, flexible, and willing to compromise. History doesn't dictate which of these paths will unfold, but it does show that the patterns repeat unless steps are taken to address the root causes. Observing these cycles can offer a map, even if the journey is never smooth. Even without predicting the future, there are clear warning signs to watch. indicators that have preceded almost every major societal upheaval in history. Hyperpolarization, where citizens see each other as enemies rather than fellow countrymen. Institutional decay, when courts, law enforcement, and government agencies lose legitimacy in the eyes of the public. Economic pressure, from soaring inequality to unaffordable essentials that strain everyday life. Loss of trust, when promises from leaders and systems are broken repeatedly. And cultural fragmentation, when shared values and national identity begin to fracture. These aren't just abstract concepts, they are real, measurable, and visible in societies across time. By recognizing them, people gain the ability to understand the subtle shifts before they explode into irreversible change. History doesn't hide its lessons, they're there for those willing to see. Across centuries and continents, the 6 stages of revolution have repeated with eerie consistency. Extreme inequality, government corruption, radicalization of the middle class, loss of faith in institutions, revolutionary momentum, and the rise of a new order. These are the chapters history has already written. The question now is not if the cycle exists, but what comes next. Will societies recognize the signs in time, or will they wait until the spark ignites? The next page is unwritten, but the patterns suggest it could be dramatic, transformative, and irreversible. History has already written these chapters. The real question is, what will the next page look like?